Hello, followers of NeuroTakeAway. Today we have the high privilege to count with the presence of an outstanding guest in our channel, Professor James Barkovich. There are very few people that have had such an influence on our field that as he had. Several books, hundreds of publications, thousands of conferences, but most of all, he provided a lot of new ideas. So, hi Jim, how are you doing?
I'm doing well, thank you. Surviving the COVID-19 so far.
How do you deal with this quarantine?
Um, well, I'm very lucky in that I've been able to work from home, and because the hospital um, management decided that they don't want the doctors coming in and out of a hospital with a lot of patients with COVID-19. And so we've been working from home, all of us.
Uh-huh.
We haven't seen my colleagues in 2 months. Uh, but, we're fortunate that we have a good computer system. And so I can look at films from home, and I can, do my dictations from home. And so we've been surviving.
Okay,
Um,
it's a strange time.
yes, in many ways.
Oh yeah. Well, the other day you said that you started studying chemistry. So
Yes.
I would like to know what made you decide to change from chemistry to medicine and especially to radiology.
Well, uh, so I was a chemistry major in college, and I thought it was very interesting, and so I went to graduate school. I was in a PhD program at University of California, Berkeley, and I did it for 3 years. And as I stayed in the lab and did my work, I realized that that wasn't what I wanted to do for the rest of my life. It's a chem lab is an interesting place, but it's very isolating.
Mhm.
You're in your laboratory and you have some graduate students, but um, you're kind of stuck in a building. And Berkeley's a wonderful place, and I would have loved to have stayed in Berkeley forever if they had
One
had
of
a
the best
medical school. Yeah,
one of the
if
best in chemistry.
yes, but so I decided, without telling my professor, I decided to apply to some medical schools just to see what happened. Maybe I'd get lucky and get in. And sure enough, I got accepted at medical school. And so then one day I had to go in, and I saw it was a guy named Peter Volhart. Um, and, he's now retired, of course. But so I went and I told Peter, I'm leaving. I'm sorry to tell you this. He said, what? you know, because I had already, had like 7 or 8 publications in my first few years of grad school. But I said, no, this isn't what I want to do. And he laughed and he said, you'll be back. You'll be back. You won't like medical school, and on and on. But, he was wrong.
Mhm.
And I still see him from time to time. But yeah, so that's what happened. And so,
Do you regret
yeah,
that? No.
pardon?
Do you regret?
No, well, there were moments in medical school when I regretted it. But no, I've been very, very happy. I felt very fortunate to, uh, you know, find myself in radiology. And then I just found brain development so interesting. And, I was fortunate enough to start at the time when MR was starting.
Oh yeah.
So,
Right moment.
right, so there was almost, I mean, I saw my first MR. So also in San Francisco, where I did my residency, they were starting MRI about the same time I was starting my residency. So I saw my first MRI when it was the first MRI ever done in San Francisco. And it was when I was a first-year resident.
Oh.
And then by the beginning of my third year, and back then it was a 3-year residency, by the beginning of my third year, there was an MRI scanner at UCSF, and I did a bunch of neuroradiology electives there. And so I got exposed to MRI when I was a resident. And then, you know, we started doing a few babies and stuff, and I got real interested in brain development and how MR was really a great tool for studying normal and abnormal brain development. So I got lucky. You know, I was lucky in my timing. I was lucky where I was, but you know, it was just so fascinating. And I've had such a rewarding career. And you know, sometimes a little bit of luck is good. And the other lucky thing is during my years in graduate school, I met the woman that I ended up marrying, and she's now been my wife for almost 40 years. So sometimes you got to have a little bit of luck in life.
Indeed, indeed. I wonder, in almost every one of your talks, there are plenty of explanations about the underlying molecular pathway, the
Yes.
metabolic pathways. I wonder, do you really think that neuroradiologists should go that far?
It depends on the neuroradiologist, doesn't it? Personally, I think I'm a better radiologist because I understand the diseases. And if you understand the disease, if you understand the chemistry, which is what it takes to understand the disease, you're going to have a better idea of what you're looking for. As opposed to, you know, the classic radiology approach is you memorize patterns and then you look at the scan and see what pattern it is. But I think if you understand the disease, that's more important than the patterns. Because you know, you're senior enough to know that no two anythings look exactly alike. There are little differences, no matter what it is. If it's an astrocytoma, they're all a little different, you know. And I think that all tumors are a little different. If you go down to the chemistry, and again, this is where the chemistry comes in, they're not all the same. Everybody's different. And if people with the same diagnosis have different lesions, every brain tumor looks a little different than every other brain tumor. Every astrocytoma looks a little different than every other astrocytoma. Every, you know, everything, every focal cortical dysplasia looks a little bit different. And so I think actually the deeper your knowledge, the better a radiologist you are, and the more you help the patients.
I agree. I agree. And it's a link between chemistry and medicine.
Yeah, there is. You're right.
Well, you know, things are also changing fast in neuro-oncology. There are new classifications that rely more and more on molecular biology and less on classical histopathology. And, do you think that radiology is keeping up with this?
I think it's real. I think it's difficult to keep up with it. Are we keeping up with it? Probably some people are. Probably more people are not keeping up with it. And I would have to say that I have two different ways that I can look at this. Number one is it would be great if we could look at all of these tumors and tell them exactly what their diagnosis is, exactly what type of tumor it is using their new classification. But there's two problems with that. The first is that I'm not sure that imaging is good enough to separate every subset of tumor. And the other thing is, similar to what we were talking about before, no two tumors are exactly the same. You can break down that classification if you want. It's like people. You know, we're all human beings, but you're different from me. I'm different from my brother. I'm different, you know, we're all different. I think tumors are all different, you know, and you can keep narrowing it down, and the more depth you look at it in, going into the chemistry and the genetics and stuff, you're going to find that every tumor is a little different than every other tumor. So classifications, and I sort of came to this conclusion many years ago since I made a few classifications. Classifications are constantly changing, but the truth is that they're all kind of, I wouldn't say we make them up, but they're not real, because no two tumors are the same. No two you know, little focal cortical dysplasias are the same. They're all different because every body is different and the way your body responds is different. So you can keep making more and more complex classifications.
Yeah.
But in the end, every lesion you look at is different than every other lesion. And so you can do it. And this is what internal medicine people really like, to make things more complicated than they have to be. And this is the classic example of that. You can divide and divide and divide, and you'll be right. They'll all be different, but at some point it's ridiculous.
Yeah.
And so really what we should be looking at, and the thing is, even if things look exactly the same, they don't always respond to the same treatment, right? So they try a treatment, it doesn't work, they try something else. So I actually think that the classification has gone beyond usefulness.
Probably.
But
yes,
that's just an aging radiologist's opinion.
Okay. Okay. I have speaking about the daily practice. I would like to know your opinion about our attitude regarding the diagnostic impression of our reports. How far do you think we have to go? We have to be more conservative. We have to get better diagnosis. What do you think?
Well, since I think that, you know, every once in a while, I mean, sometimes you know exactly what the diagnosis is. And if you know exactly what it is, you should say, this is what I say. I'm not saying, I don't want to say anybody else should do anything. But what I do is, if I'm pretty sure what the diagnosis is, I'll say, this has the appearance of a whatever, a pilocytic astrocytoma, or you know, a focal cortical dysplasia, something like that. And if I'm pretty sure that's what it is, I just give the diagnosis. If it's less certain, if it's just an enhancing lesion in the brain, then I give a differential, and I usually give 3 differential diagnoses, with, you know, saying that, you know, other less likely tumors cannot be excluded, you know, something to that effect. But I think if you start giving a differential diagnosis of more than 3 things, it just makes it confusing.
Yeah.
But I also think that, you know, for most, especially tumors, radiology is not specific. And so you shouldn't, if you say this is a glioblastoma, well, that's it's a little bit arrogant to think that we can make that diagnosis. And the pathologists especially don't like it. And they love to tell you when you're wrong. um, as we all know. Um, and so I think given a differential of three things, or and saying that, and then you can say other less likely possibilities include, and you give a few more if you're really uncertain. At least that's what I do. But I'm sure everybody has their own way
Okay.
of handling it.
It's hard for everyone to make mistakes in diagnosis. How do you deal with that?
Um, I think you never really, well, I have never really been able to deal with it well, because I go home and I berate myself. I yell at myself internally for messing that up. I don't deal with it well, but that's why given a differential when you're uncertain, is the best way to go. And what can you do? You try to learn from your mistake and not make the mistake again. I mean, I'm sure most of us are really hard on ourselves when we mess up, but we're all human, and human beings make mistakes. And sometimes you're just having a bad day, or sometimes you talk to them while you have three people on the telephone, and maybe you haven't really been as focused as you should have been. I mean, it happens, and you have to learn to deal with it. And you try to, the best way to deal with it is to be more focused the next time,
Hmm.
and just do a better
Sometimes the
job.
problem is that you get stuck to a diagnosis and neglect the reality. the
Yes.
Try to fit everything with what you are thinking. Um, so that's the main problem, I think. Well, another nowadays it's very tough, at least in Argentina, to publish, to do clinical research, especially in our countries. I don't know in the States, but I think it may be the same. Uh, how do you organize to be so productive in your life? How did you organize?
Well, I think nowadays, I mean, it would be more difficult. I mean, when I first started uh, writing papers, although, I wrote, well, when I first started writing papers, I did it, in the end of the day and on weekends and stuff. This was when I was a fellow. When I became an attending, early on, we just weren't that busy. In the early days of MRI, um, we have one or two scanners, and the scans took, I don't know if you remember, I mean, there was like 45 minutes to do, an axial and a sagittal, a T1, a T2, and a sagittal took an hour.
Yeah.
And so we weren't all that busy, and there was time. I remember when I first started at UCSF, uh, I would read out for the morning for 2 hours, and in the afternoon for 2 hours, and that took care of everything, because we had three or four, three MR scanners and maybe three CT scanners, and you'd read, 15 studies in the morning, and that would take 2 hours, and then the residents would dictate and the fellows would dictate, and I'd go in my office and work on a paper. Now we have 20 MRI scanners, and they're just coming in one after another, and we start the first shift at 7 in the morning, and the last shift is over at 9 o'clock at night, and you're just constantly busy. It's a lot more difficult now. So the only way we can get time is to get grants. So if you write a grant and your grant gets funded, then depending on what percentage of your salary is covered by salary from the grant, you get that much research time.
Yes.
And so that's how I've done it for the last like 15 plus years, is, writing grants. And then I was 60% funded for a long time by grants, and so I would only work clinically 2 days a week, and I would have 3 research days every week.
Interesting. Well, that's very interesting. Yes, we in our countries it's much more difficult to get a grant. There
Yeah.
are no much grants, not many grants, but well, it's a good advice. I would like to know your opinion about the future, especially taking into account the artificial intelligence stuff. Do you think that radiology as we know it now will survive?
Well, if you think about it, radiology as we know it now is far different from radiology as we knew it 30 years ago. And I think it will continue to change. I think the demand will be greater. I think that the technology will improve, and that'll make it easier to read the studies more quickly. I think that there probably will be, at some point, some sort of artificial intelligence that scans the scan, have as a computer scanning the images, and the computer will alert you to abnormalities. But I think that's going to be difficult. And at first it'll be a real problem because, the good thing about humans is that we know that every brain looks a little bit different. And so when you've been doing it for 4 or 5 years, which is your training period, you recognize what's normal and what's abnormal. I don't think machines are I don't want to say they're not that smart, but I don't think they're that flexible.
Flexible.
And so, you or I, who have been looking at scans for, we won't say how many years, but for a while,
Yeah.
We are saying, oh yeah, I remember when I was a resident, and my attending would say, oh yeah, we see that sometimes, and I didn't really know what that meant. But now I know what that means. We don't know exactly what it is, but we see it in a lot of people who don't have any problems, and we know that it's not abnormal.
Okay.
And I think that experience is really helpful. And I think eventually you can probably program that into computers, but that's a little more difficult because they all look a little different, but that it's nothing. And that's going to be hard to, I think, teach a computer.
Flexibility is our...
I think so. Yeah, flexibility is a good word for it. Yeah. I think that, and experience.
Yeah.
And although there is machine learning now, I think human learning is a little more sophisticated than machine learning. And I think that someone like you or me or someone who's been looking at MR scans for 40 years, says, oh, what one of my mentors used to say, oh, we see that. It's something that you just see and it's nothing. And we didn't know exactly what it was, but we knew it was nothing. And I think that that's difficult to teach a machine.
Okay. Well, the last question, because we are running out of time. What recommendations would you give to a young neuroradiologist?
Well, I guess the most important thing is, you need to look you need to learn all about radiology, but go to the literature and read about all the pathology, and what I did, I actually, what the person who had the biggest influence on my career, non-radiologist, is a guy named Pasko Rakic, who you've never heard of.
No.
He's a Croatian neuroscientist. He was the head of neuroscience at Yale University for a long time. And I literally stumbled upon some of his papers when I was spending time in Toronto at the Hospital for Sick Children when I was a fellow, a neuroradiology fellow. And I started reading his papers, and it turned out that, you know, he's Croatian. He born in Croatia, which he comes from very close to where my relatives still live in Croatia. And so he sent me a pack. So I read some of his papers and I wrote him a letter and I said, "Dear Dr. Akich, you don't know me. I'm a radiologist, a neuroradiologist, and I've read some of your papers. I'm fascinated by brain development. And if it's possible, could you send me some reprints or something?" And so 3 weeks later, I got this huge box delivered to me, which was full of reprints of chapters that he'd written and manuscripts that he'd published and stuff. And I read all of that and I learned how the brain forms. And once you understand all the embryology and stuff, the anomalies, you can say, oh, of course, that's how that formed and that's how that happened and stuff. So I think that understanding the diseases is the key. You know, you think as a radiologist, oh, you don't need to understand all that physiology and embryology and stuff. But especially if you're doing pediatric stuff, if you don't understand brain embryology, you're not going to understand what you're looking at. So if you want to do pediatric neuroradiology, you should understand brain development. If you want to do oncology, if you want to do tumors, you should read about the tumors. You want to understand the tumors as well as the oncologist. You don't need to know about the treatment, but if you understand the disease, it makes you a much better radiologist.
Okay.
That would be my advice.
Yes. Well, Jim, thank you very much for your time. I think it was amazing to listen to you. Our audience will be delighted. I'm sure most of them admire you as much as I do. So thank you
It's been my pleasure.
Come back to Argentina. You should know the South, the Patagonia.
Okay, well, that's one of my goals, is to go to Patagonia, and you give me an invitation and I'll find a way to come.
Okay, I take your word. Bye-bye.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you very much.